In September 1939, World War II exploded across Europe. In a matter of months, the war spread to multiple countries across the continent and soon, the globe. There was a lot at stake, and nations across Europe hastened to pick up a metaphorical side or do whatever they could to remain neutral. Despite the quick onset of war, it didn't spread evenly. The Axis powers had a plan, and eventually, that plan came to Greece. On October 28, 1940, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini demanded that Greece surrender to the Axis powers. The Greek Prime Minister, Ioannis Metaxas, responded with a declarative no, thus heralding the start of the Greco-Italian War and beginning the Axis powers' Balkans campaign. The Italians attempted to invade Greece from Albania, which was their protectorate at the time. Against all odds, the Greeks managed to repel the initial Italian invasion with the help of the British, then pushed into the Italian protectorate and occupied its southern territories. However, the Greek successes came to a halt on April 6, 1941, when the Germans finally pushed down through Bulgaria. The Battle of Greece, as it came to be known, or Operation Marita, saw a resounding victory for the German forces. It took them 4 days to take Thessaloniki, the second largest city in Greece, and on April 27th, the Germans entered the capital city of Athens and raised the Nazi flag above the Acropolis. Greece surrendered, and the Axis occupation of the country began. Despite their crushing defeat at the hands of the Germans, the Greeks did not take their defeat lying down. Over the next 4 years, they were crushed under an incredibly brutal occupier's heel, but it didn't break their spirit. Fronts of resistance assembled to take the fight to their occupiers, fighting for Greece's freedom. At the same time, Greek civilians risked their lives and families to aid the guerrilla fighters and allied forces. Despite their limited resources and brutal anti-resistance measures, the Greeks fought on to an extent that drew the admiration of great powers across Europe. Today, we'll be telling their story. Between April 1941 and October 1944, Greece was occupied by the Axis powers. The country was divided between the three occupying forces: Germans, Bulgarians, and Italians. Following the country's total occupation in April of 1941, the Axis powers appointed a new government staffed by their collaborators. Although it's impossible to quantify brutality, contemporary sources stated the Italians were the most lenient occupiers. The Bulgarians were particularly vicious in their occupation of northern Greece due to their interest in the territories bordering Bulgaria. The Germans, on the other hand, were clinically and efficiently brutal. During the Axis occupation of Greece, Greece suffered the greatest loss of life and the most destruction out of any non-Slavic country in Europe. A conservative estimate puts the country's total losses at 50,000 people who lost their lives as resistance fighters or because of German retaliation, 50 to 60,000 Jews who were displaced to concentration camps, tens of thousands of civilians who died of starvation. Out of a population of 7 million, Greece lost an estimated total of 300,000. In total, 800 villages and towns were razed to the ground. Under German occupation, restrictions were immediately placed on civilians. Among other suppression measures, the Germans imposed a nighttime curfew on all citizens. Heavy censorship laws were established. Anyone suspected of anti-German activity was arrested, then tortured or executed. In many cities, such as Thessaloniki, Ioannina, and Corfu, where a significant Jewish presence had prospered, the Jews were systematically rounded up and transported to concentration camps. One of the Germans' first priorities was plundering the country's resources. Greece's national treasury was emptied out, but the Germans didn't stop at gold. They systematically looted livestock and agricultural resources, particularly food. The famine that resulted from these seizures led to extreme food shortages across the country. In the urban centres, where people were unable to forage scraps off the land, tens of thousands of people starved to death or fled to the countryside. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, it's estimated that 300 people died daily in Athens from starvation alone. 90-year-old Logothetis, a child at the time, remembered what it was like in occupied Athens when we interviewed him about his lived experiences. We lived in Athens back then. When things got too difficult, we left for the village where we could live off the land. It wasn't much. A goat, some weeds from wherever they could find. My aunt brought back large plants, juicy and tasty. When they asked her where she'd found them, she admitted she'd picked them in the cemetery where the soil was fertile. There are many testimonies of what people would eat during this time to avoid starvation. Flour and water was one common dish. Another was stealing food scraps from the trash the occupiers threw out, such as fruit peels. One reason the Italians were considered more merciful than the Germans is because they would directly give children food scraps, unlike the Germans, who destroyed any food waste so the locals could have nothing. For the purpose of this video, we were able to interview 89-year-old Alexandra Margu, who lived in the town of Soufli to the northeast of Greek during the occupation. Although her town was far from the large urban centres, she recalls many harsh measures the Germans imposed. At nights, we had to black out the windows so no lights could shine through. We hung heavy curtains in the windows and kept to one room. They were afraid of air raids. One night, my mother forgot to block a window out and the Germans came to our house. They took my father's ID as punishment and told him to retrieve it the next day and to bring them 30 eggs. The Germans were the most brutal, however, when it came to retaliating against local resistance group activity. When asked, Alexandra remembers how the Germans dealt with the threat of resistance. They rounded up anyone they thought was connected to the resistance and held them in a jail near the town square. They held entire families, sometimes including the children. One time, the partisans killed one Nazi. In retaliation, the Germans brought 8 civilians out and executed them publicly in the town square. "One of us for 8 of you," they said. The partisans didn't kill another German for the entire occupation. This, of course, wasn't the only incident of German retaliation. Throughout the occupation, the Germans used the threat of retaliation against civilians as a way to dissuade the resistance from their activities. Entire communities were razed to the ground, their population executed and their buildings burnt to a cinder. In total, over 800 communities were wiped off the map. These burnings are known as holocausts in Greek, a word meaning completely burnt away. We'll still be using the word to refer to these events, but they shouldn't be confused with the Holocaust of the Jews, which is entirely unrelated. There are too many communities to list, but we'll mention some of the most tragic incidents of German retaliation. On October 25th, 1941, the Germans destroyed the villages of Klisto, Ambelofito, and Kedonia in one day in retaliation for partisan victories in the area. On May 31st, 1944, 40 civilians were publicly hanged in a small village called Orman Magula. This execution was retaliation for the actions of the Greek Liberation Army, who had sabotaged the Volos-Kalambaka train and caused it to explode, killing 4 Germans. The most brutal incident, however, was the Holocaust of Kalavrita, widely recognized as the worst war crime in Greek history. Operation Kalavrita began on December 4th, 1943, as a mass retaliation for the deaths of 77 German soldiers who'd been imprisoned by the partisans. The Nazis aimed to terrorize the locals and dissuade the partisans from further action. Throughout the operation, they burnt over 1,000 homes to the ground in over 50 villages. As they moved through the countryside, the Nazis looted anything valuable such as livestock and food stores to ensure the survivors would starve to death. In total, 677 unarmed civilians were executed, 499 of whom were in Kalavrita, the final target of the operation. On December 9th, Wehrmacht forces occupied the town and set its homes ablaze. On December 13th, the town's population was gathered in front of the town school where the women, children, and the elderly were separated from the men and boarded up in the building. The men were marched to a hill overlooking the burning village locally known as the Kapi's Back. The hill's amphitheatrical layout meant any who tried to escape could be gunned down. There, nearly 500 men were executed by rapid gunfire while they watched their homes burn. The women and children, meanwhile, watched as their townsmen were executed, all while the flames licked ever closer. Thankfully, they managed to escape the school and fled before the flames reached it. Despite the merciless retaliation by the Germans, the Greeks didn't go quietly into that good night. On the contrary, Greek resistance kept rising throughout the occupation, with valiant efforts made not only by the resistance fighters themselves, but also unarmed civilians. As one nation, Greece rose to the challenge of reclaiming their freedom, and everyone did their part. From the beginning, the Greek people revolted against their German occupiers, sometimes as individuals, but most often as collective movements. On May 30th, 1941, barely a month after the Nazi flag had been raised on the Acropolis, two youths, Manolis Glezos and Lakis Santas, snuck onto the ancient monument and tore down the Nazi swastika, raising the Greek flag to wave once more above the capital. Although short-lived, this act of blatant defiance was incredibly symbolic for the resisting Greeks. On another front, a unit of PUFY, the Pan-Hellenic Union of Fighting Youths, bombed the headquarters of the National Socialist Patriotic Organization, a local organization of Nazi collaborators. When the order came for the Jews to be gathered and deported to the concentration camps, everyday Greeks rose to the occasion and took young Jewish children into their homes, hiding them from the Germans, despite knowing that, were they to be caught harboring a Jew, they would face the firing squad. As a community, the Greeks rose together to form the resistance. It wasn't something the men did alone. Women, the elderly, and particularly the youths were involved in fighting back against the Nazi regime. By the autumn of 1941, organized resistance movements had formed. The most influential one was the National Liberation Front, known as EAM in Greek. Formed by the Communist Party of Greece, or the KKE, in collaboration with smaller left-wing parties, the EAM spearheaded the resistance. In February of 1942, they established the Greek People's Liberation Army, or ELAS, which was their military branch. What EAM fought for was liberating Greece from its foreign occupiers and guaranteeing the right of the Greek people to determine their post-war government. From a more right-wing political party came the Greek National Democratic Union, or EDES, which was a smaller resistance movement. EAM partisans took to guerrilla warfare across the country as a way of facing down the better-equipped Germans. Hiding in the mountains, partisans raided German outposts or convoys, sabotaged critical supply lines, and executed Axis soldiers whenever they could. Thanks to their mobility, it was impossible for the occupying forces to pin them down. To dissuade the partisans from their guerrilla tactics, the Nazis retaliated heavily against civilians and formed security brigades to terrorize the locals. On multiple occasions, ELAS and EDES forces cooperated with Allied forces to sabotage the Germans. On November 25, 1942, Operation Harling saw the demolition of Gorgopotamos Bridge by a team of ELAS, EDES, and British Special Operations Executive Forces. This was the first major Axis sabotage in Europe. Thanks to Operation Harling, German supply lines supporting their troops in Africa were disrupted, and the Germans could no longer resupply through Greece. The British-Greek cooperation was best seen on the island of Crete. As the German armies invaded Greece in April of 1941, all remaining Commonwealth soldiers were forced to evacuate the country. In May of 1941, Wehrmacht paratroopers descended on the island in what would come to be known as the Battle of Crete. they weren't prepared for the ferocious local resistance, which saw civilians attacking and killing several German parachuters with knives, axes, scythes, or even barehanded. Although the Germans succeeded in securing the island, it was at a heavy cost. Following the German occupation of the island, many British SOE forces were stranded, unable to evacuate. The locals immediately rose to the occasion, establishing communication with Egypt by boat and evacuating many British and Dominion soldiers. Those that chose to remain or were unable to evacuate found refuge in the local Greeks' homes, who took them in and hid them from the Germans. SOE and RAF forces teamed up with the Cretan resistance, who in time adopted the mantle of the mainland's EAM to sabotage German assets on the island, as Crete was being used by the Axis powers to resupply their forces in Africa. Together, the British and Cretans struck many successful blows to the Axis powers, such as by destroying the Castelli and Heraklion airfields and abducting General Heinrich Kuiper. Sir Patrick Leigh Fermor, a British SOE officer stationed on Crete, had this to say of the Cretans' resilience. When the Germans invaded Crete, their armies had just defeated the whole of Europe. Logically, the civilian population could have been expected to remain inactive while the professionals, the British Commonwealth, and a small number of Greek troops fought it out with the invaders. But to the great astonishment of both sides, all over the island, bodies of Cretans, villagers, shepherds, old men, boys, monks, and priests, and even women, without any collusion between them or master plan or arms or guidance from the official combatants, rose up at once and threw themselves on the invaders. The British forces found themselves as scattered, isolated cells across the island's mountains. Their means of communication were local runners who would unerringly deliver intel from cell to cell. Sir Patrick Leigh Fermor said about his cell's runner, Psi Koundakis was a great favourite of everyone's, for his humour, high spirits, pluck and imagination, and above all, the tireless zest with which he threw himself into the task. If anybody could put a girdle round Crete in 40 minutes, he could. Crete wasn't the only place civilians directly involved themselves in supporting the resistance and its fighters. Urban centres took collective action to defy their occupiers. In April of 1942, telecommunications workers went on one of occupied Europe's first strikes. In January of 1943, they succeeded in blocking the Germans from sending Greeks to forced labour camps in Germany. The funeral procession of Kostis Palamas, national poet of Greece, was also an act of open defiance, as thousands took to the streets against Nazi suppression measures. In the countryside, towns and villages smuggled supplies and intel to the guerrilla fighters active in their areas. Alexandra Margul recalled her experiences of her family and neighbours supporting the partisans, saying, "We were 3 houses built together, us, the baker, and the electrician. Back then, we didn't have electricity meters. We paid per light bulb. Whenever needed, my mother put us girls to bed early and the electrician snuck in to unscrew our light bulb. He would then plug in a huge battery so it would charge until 11 PM when the electricity was shut off. The partisans needed these for their wireless radios. It took 2 nights to charge the batteries. During the day, they would hide it in a hole covered with mulberry leaves, and when they were charged, my neighbour hid 2 baskets filled with manure and took them to his vineyard on the mountainside. The partisans collected them from there. Once, when they needed to charge the batteries as an emergency, they hosted a party in the bakery. The Germans would always come to feast and drink with the locals. That night, they hosted the Germans on the top floor of the bakery while, in the basement, they secretly charged the batteries. The Germans ordered the electricity to not be shut off so they could drink more, and so they charged them in 1 night instead of 2. She also recounted how they hid the partisans in their own homes. "We had large sallies in our homes where we raised our silkworms. In our house, we hosted EAM meetings at night. In our neighbour's house, the partisans would hide when they came in from the mountain." For 4 years, the Greek people, guerrilla fighters, and civilians alike fought tenaciously against the Germans, and their bravery and courage in the face of the Axis invasion and occupation drew the admiration of political leaders around the world. Winston Churchill praised their courage in a statement he made at the House of Commons on April 24, 1941. "The word heroism, I am afraid, does not render the least of those acts of self-sacrifice of the Greeks, which were the defining factor in the victorious outcome of the common struggle of the nations during World War II for the human freedom and dignity. If it were not for the bravery of Greeks and their courage, the outcome of World War II would be undetermined." A few months after the German invasion, Franklin Roosevelt also shared his thoughts on their tenacity. The heroic struggle of the Greek people to defend their liberties and their homes against the aggression of Germany after they had so signally defeated the Italian attempt at invasion has stirred the hearts and aroused the sympathy of the whole American people. Finally, in January of 1943, Joseph Stalin made a statement after the victory at the Battle of Stalingrad. He was quoted saying, "I'm sorry because I'm getting old and I shall not live long to thank the Greek people whose resistance decided World War II." The June 6, 1944 Normandy landings heralded the end of the Axis powers. With the Red Army's march toward Germany and the upheaval in Romania, Nazi Germany was forced to pull its forces out of Greece. The EAM had already liberated a huge percentage of the mainland's territory and had set up a national government in exile known as the Government of the Mountain. On October 12, 1944, the German occupying force left Athens. 2 days later, the British arrived in the city and were welcomed with enthusiasm. 4 days after that, the government in exile arrived in the capital. Greece was finally free, and the difficult act of rebuilding had to begin. It turned out to be more difficult than anyone had imagined. More than half a century later, damage dealt by the Axis occupiers is still felt today in modern Greece. Hundreds of thousands had lost their lives, almost 1,000 towns and villages had been utterly destroyed, and the resources the country had gathered after World War I had been looted. The road of recovery for Greece was hard, and the intense political division left behind by World War II led not to a unified country, but to a bitter civil war that saw war heroes executed as enemies of the state. But for those years of struggle against the Axis powers, the Greeks fought together, and they fought like heroes. So that's how a small, underdog country managed to win the respect of some of the most war-hardened politicians of the 20th century. Had you ever heard of Greece's valiant resistance against the Axis powers? Would you be interested in a deeper dive into how Greece managed to repel the Italian invaders and force Nazi Germany to intervene? Are you interested in hearing more about the Greek Civil War? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.